Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Erik Skopil on the show. I'm Matt Prehm. It's a Monday. It's Transfer Palooza Monday. It's College Football Playoff Palooza Monday. We're going to break it all down on this show today. We've got the field set. Oregon, obviously, is the number one seed in the college football playoffs. I imagine, Erik, we're going to discuss about the reward, air quotes, that Oregon got by being the one seed.
Sure.
We'll also dive into some portal talk. There's been a couple names from Oregon already hit, so we'll talk about that. We'll also dive into just kind of the needs for this team to maneuver. But first, let's go to playoffs. The number one seed is the Ducks, naturally. Georgia's 2, Boise State's 3. You're fighting Kenny Dillingham's of the Arizona State Sun Devils are number 4. And then this is where it gets weird. Like Texas is 5 after losing in the SEC championship game. Penn State drops to 6. Notre Dame is 7. Ohio State is 8. Tennessee is 9. Indiana 10. And then SMU 11 and Clemson 12. Penn State actually, on paper, and this is like we know games aren't played out on paper, but from a pure strength of schedule and toughest path on paper perspective, Oregon wins the Big Ten. They get the harder seed out of the two teams. Penn State drops to 6, and they play an SMU team that has really no signature win next to their name, and they win that game. They play Boise State, and they get to the semifinals of the championship. Oregon's got Tennessee and Ohio State, and as Dan Lanning put it on Sunday afternoon in the Rose Bowl, and then he said it again on ESPN when the first bracket came out. Like, kudos to us if it's a little harder and we have to go through this path. I guess my hot take here is let's just say for a second Ohio State wins, and then Oregon plays Texas in the semifinals, and then has to beat Georgia in the national championship game. Like the run that they did, the teams that they played in the regular season, and to do it and go perfect, Oregon would have a claim to the best team in modern day college football. And I guess that's what's in front of you.
Well, it would certainly be, and of course, there's no history of playing this many games to win a championship. It would certainly be the most impressive run because if you look at it, those are the teams you ran through. Those are the teams with the best odds in the futures to win a national championship. And these were, frankly, the 3 teams that in the preseason were right there with Oregon as the top 4 teams. Like this was tier 1 all year was Ohio State, Texas, Georgia, and Oregon. And the fact that it's shaping up to where Oregon will have to beat all those teams on the path is just it's kind of an unfortunate outcome. And the reality here is this is all because of the auto buys for the conference champions. Because if this was seeded based purely on the College Football Committee's rankings, the 8-9 matchup is Boise State, Indiana. And that's a lot more palatable, a lot more understandable opening game for Oregon in the quarterfinals in Pasadena. Instead, you might have to play again Ohio State. And this is the part that we should also address is Oregon is obviously the number 1 seed for a reason. Those 3 teams that we're talking about, they're kind of flawed right now. Let's be real. Yeah. Both of them are, both the teams on Oregon's side, Ohio State and Texas, are coming off losses. And Georgia lost its starting quarterback, and we don't know what Carson Beck's availability will be. I guess if Oregon were to play them in the national championship game, I imagine by then he's available, but who knows? But maybe they're susceptible. And I've seen like one of the popular national championship game predictions right now is Oregon Notre Dame, which I think would be pretty favorable. But to my original point here and to the one you were making, it's unfortunate that Oregon does what it does and wins its 13 games. And the prize is a very difficult path, which will, theoretically, if everybody takes care of business, include kind of all the other heavy hitters in college football this season. But to the point I know Dan's made and other people make, you're going to have to beat the best to win this thing anybody. So you might as well just take care of it early. But, I think the other part is I'm not overly confident that Ohio State beats Tennessee, and Texas could lose to Clemson. I mean, these are not impossible outcomes. I know the lines are heavily favored for both the better seeds. Those are home games, so they have a pretty big advantage there. But there's not. Oregon's the only team that's won every game this season, and they're almost the only team with only 1 loss this season that's in this field. Notre Dame being the only other team that can say that. So, it's I think it's unfortunate. At the same time, I'm not entering this going, well, Oregon can't do it. I still have a lot of confidence Oregon can beat any of the teams in this bracket. It's just unfortunate that they've drawn the toughest path to it. And we're not the only ones saying this, to be clear, Matt. Like, you go listen to the college football podcasts, you go read what people are saying online. I mean, the initial reaction was, wow, what a screwed up deal where Oregon goes 13-0, is the only team that can say that, draws the number 1 seed, and then would have to play the teams we just talked about. It's unfortunate, but we'll get into some of the breakdowns the closer we get to this. But I still think it's far from unlikely that Oregon runs the table and wins this thing and ends up 16-0, and does so in impressive fashion. But to your point, Matt, it's going to take an all-time run of beating a lot of really, really good teams to get there. I mean, imagine after the end of this thing, Oregon will have said they beat Ohio State twice, Penn State once, Boise State once. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, Texas and Georgia. I mean, that's a really, really impressive run of success if they're able to do all that, and would make their first national championship all that much sweeter.
I mean, every team would have won a national championship except for Boise that you would play.
Yeah.
You knocked off teams that, you knock off if they're a Power 5 team, or I guess now a Power 4 team, like everyone that you beat has won a national championship in multiple. And then you beat the greatest group of 5 program in college football history in Boise State to do it, who's been giant killers before. I'm also on board with you about, like, I'm not sold that Ohio State beats Tennessee at home. And we should note, like, you and I, we know the Ohio State program, but we're not all the way in tune with what the Buckeyes are doing right now. But we do know their offensive line has been dealt with injuries. Josh Simmons against Oregon in the first game, their starting left tackle went out. He was a first-round draft pick. He's not playing in this game. The guy that replaced him is out for the season as well with an injury. Their starting center, I believe, has torn his Achilles. So,
yes, Seth McLaughlin. Yep.
Yes. And he was an all-conference Big Ten player. So they are not the same team that Oregon played in the middle of October. And yes, Oregon is not the same team either. But Oregon hasn't been dealt a season-ending injury, knock on wood, I guess, if you're Oregon there, for this playoff game. They're getting guys back. They're getting closer to where they were prior to that game being played from a health standpoint. And I'm on board with you as well. Like, what's the mental psyche of this Ohio State team? Because they lost at home to Michigan, a team that they had no business losing to. I think they were a 20-point favorite at home, and that eliminated them from the college from playing in the Big Ten championship game and from getting the rematch that they so often talked about playing against Oregon. Now they're going to potentially get the rematch in the Rose Bowl, but they still have, Jeremiah Smith. They still have Emeka Ibuka. They still have their 2 talented running backs, and their secondary is good. But I would think going into that game, knowing the health, injuries that they've dealt with along the offensive line, knowing how well Oregon's front 4 was able to generate pressure against that group healthy, and knowing the success that Oregon had in that game, they'll be a favorite. And, it probably won't be 6, 7, 8 points, but it'd probably be similar to Penn State, like 3.5, 4 points in favor of Oregon. And we should note that Oregon's spending the next 3 weeks dialing in on Tennessee, dialing in on Ohio State film, and working on their self-scouts. These 2 teams are having to go through the preparations of playing against each other, and at the same time preparing for a second game that may not happen. Like, Oregon's in the advantage. I still believe, even though that Oregon has a tough path by winning the number 1 seed in the playoffs, I still think this is the correct way to go. You still want the bye week. You still want the time to prepare. You still want the rest. And we'll get to it here in the second half of the show from a recruiting perspective. I think there's going to be a huge element, too, from a recruiting standpoint of having this bye week as well. But I'm with you. Ohio State, Tennessee, like I don't think Ohio State's the shoe-in to just automatically get to the Rose Bowl. And if it's Tennessee, they've got talent. They've got a strong run game. They have dudes on defense, but I think that's a better matchup. And if you're Oregon and you're really picking here, I think you want Tennessee to win, but neither team should strike so much fear in the eye of Oregon that it's, oh, woe is me. How are we going to win this game?
And back to the first part there, I guess, because I got a couple reactions. I agree about where Ohio State is susceptible is an area where Tennessee is very strong, which is up front. And we just saw Michigan, lowly Michigan this season, do what they did and make that a really muddy, ugly game and find a way to win 13-10. I think you're probably going to need more points this time around based upon the offenses that both teams possess, but maybe it's another game where Tennessee's able to do that and make it ugly. And, I totally agree that, Oregon would be favored, I think, against both those teams. I'd probably rather play Tennessee just from a proximity perspective of the Rose Bowl. I don't think Ohio's a million times closer than Tennessee necessarily, but Ohio State fans have a kind of a history of going to Pasadena. They know what this is like, and they frankly have a massive fan base. I've been there where, I know I made the comment on the other night about Oregon having, the home field advantage in a Rose Bowl setting. Maybe I'll back off a little bit because I do remember Oregon, Ohio State, about over more than a decade ago playing in a game down there and being like, wow, there's an awful lot of red here. I thought this was a West Coast team versus a Midwest team, and it didn't really feel that way. So, but it's not going to be a cakewalk for either team either, and I know Oregon would be favored against both teams. Oregon could easily lose to either of those teams. That's the unfortunate nature of the way this plays out, because I think if Oregon were to be in Penn State spot where they're playing, Boise State theoretically in that game, Oregon's already beaten Boise State. Frankly, Boise State hasn't looked very good the last couple of weeks. I know they had a conference championship win there, but they didn't score in the entire second half against UNLV, and UNLV had 2 red zone trips where they came up empty at the end. So that feels like a much more winnable path. And then the other part here that, because there's kind of been, I don't want to say there's a woe is me mentality, but there's been some disappointment, I think, from the fan base and how this is playing out. I do think the bye week, like you're right, Matt, there's the element of preparation. There's also the element of preserving health. And Oregon doesn't have to play a game. Yep. You get hurt playing games. Would it surprise
you? These types of elite versus elite, it's
a slugfest.
It's going to be in college football.
Right. And so it opens the door for, would it be surprising if you came out of that opening round game and said, either team that wins loses a player or two that are, pretty consequential, and that's a storyline entering, the quarterfinal in Pasadena? That wouldn't be, to me, surprising at all. So I think that's the other element of it. And again, it comes back to my first point, though, that I made, which is Tennessee's last 2 games, Ohio State's last 2 games, Texas now last 2 games, Clemson's last 3 games, Arizona State's last 2 games. Everybody on the side of the bracket has 2 or more losses. And you look at the other side of the bracket, it's the same story. And I think it's really fascinating now with Georgia, not to go too far into that storyline, but that's based upon seeding. That's the second ranked team in this whole thing. What's going on at quarterback there? Do they have the time to get healthy? Because it could open the door for some real chaos on that side of the bracket, where maybe Oregon has a really tough time getting through the quarterfinal and the semifinals. Maybe they have to beat Ohio State and Texas, but maybe lying on the other side of that is Notre Dame or a rematch with Penn State, which feel, to me at least, like games that Oregon would have a really good chance of winning. So there's not a team in this field that Oregon can't beat. There's not a team in this field I feel really necessarily strikes fear, but there's also a lot of teams there that have a ton of talent. And this is a year where we know things can happen here. And it would be a storyline, I'm sure, that the Oregon fans will be talking about for years if Oregon goes 13-0 and then they have to go through this gauntlet and they drop one of these games in probably a really competitive, maybe controversial fashion. And that would be just another kind of, shot to the heart for a fan base that so desperately wants to win a national championship. But again, I still think it's very, very, very much on the table. And you have to like having a bye week because it gives you opportunity to stay healthy and kind of get everything going here.
How much do we feel like from a fan base perspective of this sucks, we got dealt a harder seed than we should have, is just from like the true unfamiliarity of being in this position? Because The Ducks have gone 12-0 one other time, and this is the first time they've gone 13-0. But even in the year when they went 12-0, they entered the BCS playoff, I guess BCS championship game as the underdog, as the 2 seed. Auburn was the number 1 ranked team. They were also undefeated. They were favored to win, even though it was slim. Like CBS Sports put out, like, and some of our national guys on 24/7 Sports are involved in this, but they put out their like bracket picks. There's 8 of them. 4 of them have Oregon winning, and it's a very it's very common. It's the favorable pick right now that everyone says Oregon's going to win. And like you said, they're the only team that went 13-0. There's only one other team in college football that has 1 loss this season. This is, to an extent, uncharted territory for Oregon to be perceived in, hey, like they are the best team. There's always been, we think they're the best team, or they may be the best team going into the playoffs. So they may present the toughest matchup. That's why they're going to beat Florida State and then beat Ohio State in the national championship game. Like there's been years where that's an okay pick, but Oregon's the overwhelming pick, and that's kind of new territory. And for a fan base that's historically has seen Oregon always kind of just come up one step short, it just feels a little different to hear. Like it's different. We aren't homers, but it's different to hear it from us than to hearing the national guys for our company and for other companies go, yeah, Oregon's the favorite. That's who I'm picking.
I think the other part, Matt, and I think that's right, is there's unfamiliarity with this format because it's the first time we've seen it. And so the draws of this, which I'm curious to see how long this format's in place, because there's so much backlash. You said next week by mistake. I might be changed as soon as next week. I mean, we might see it. I mean, would you be surprised if the SEC and the Big Ten commissioners come out like before the thing even starts and goes, there needs to be changes made? I mean, the SEC is livid. Alabama's talking about restructuring its non-conference schedule, which by the way had nothing to do with the reason they're out. That's because they couldn't win their conference games. They won all their non-conference games. That wasn't the problem. But so back to my kind of original point here. Yeah, this covering college basketball. Like these seeds, these brackets come out every year, and there's always a sense of this team kind of got a raw deal. Whether it's a 1 seed seemingly having a more difficult path than a 2 seed, or the number 1 overall seed having a more difficult path than the number 4 overall seed. You know what I mean? Like there's always a little of that inequity, and that's always the conversation. And that's what I kind of have likened this to is people, because I think everybody agrees Oregon has the toughest path pretty clearly, but that's not unusual in these scenarios. It sucks for Oregon in terms of you wish you had it, flipped around a little bit differently. But it's not unusual in college sports, and in the NCAA tournament, it happens basically every year where you look up and go like, gosh, man, it seems like UCLA should have gotten a much easier path, or Oregon or whoever it is should have gotten an easier path. And instead it feels like, oh man, Kansas, who was a 3 seed, ends up in the Final Four because their path was easier or whatever. So, and that's what I like in this too, as well, is I think it's the unfamiliar, the lack of history with Oregon being a front runner like this and the kind of the national favorite. And also it's the lack of history with this format, which again, it might be the only year this format's in place, because it makes a ton more sense. Like if you were to, like I said it earlier, if you were to look up and say Boise State and Indiana are the teams that are playing in the opening round and Oregon will be one of them in the quarters, I think everybody would say, sign me up for that. That feels like a game you're going to be favored by 2 touchdowns with, regardless of which team wins. I don't know necessarily what the opening line would be, Ohio State or Tennessee, but I know it's a lot less than that. And my guess is it might be with Ohio State as small as 2 to 3 points. So it's going to be fascinating. We've got a lot of runway for this, and maybe that's the natural transition to talk about what's more immediate, which is the NCAA transfer portal. Which, by the way, we talked about it last week, how the National Signing Day schedule sucks because it's right in the middle of conference championship week. How about the transfer portal happening right in the middle of the break before the bowl games and the college football playoff? I know we've been here for a while now, but it just blows my mind every year how terrible all of this is structured. And I don't necessarily have like a great fix for it, Matt, because the reality is these are students that need to enroll for spring and they want to get that done before January. But we've got to find a better solution for doing this, because it is very, very strange that you're looking up going like Oregon's already losing players that now can't play in the bowl games. Not that these players would have necessarily played, before the season's already over. You don't see this in any other sport where like players are changing teams like in the middle of the playoffs.
Right.
Yeah.
And that I want to lean into that here in a second. That's what I teased earlier. But I want to respond to one thing from the seeding perspective. You brought up college basketball, and you're right. In that tournament, it's the best tournament in all of sports, in my opinion. It's the most exciting.
Mm-hmm.
But they reward automatic bids, but they do not reward automatic bids for a certain seed line. You win your conference, you get in the tournament, but that doesn't mean you automatically vault to the very top of the list to get a higher seed. Oregon last year won the automatic bid in the Pac-12, and I think I can't remember their seed line, but I want to say it was like 7 or 10 or something of that nature. It wasn't good, and conference champion had to play a 2 seed, a Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final Four caliber Creighton team in the second round, and they won their conference. But they didn't do their job during the season to enhance their seed line. I don't know why college football decided to do that. I think that's going to be the easy, simple fix. Is they're still going to give out conference championships. They're still going to give out automatic bids to the winner of that game, but it's no longer going to come with the automatic you jolt to the top 4, and it shouldn't have in the first place. That seems like the easy fix. And I think I was watching the college football selection show, and they had this very debate, and they talked about how it was Heather Dinich. She came on, and I think she's probably the most dialed-in reporter in college football on this process, on this playoff committee. And she said, like, hey, everyone basically agreed to this prior, so no one really should complain because everyone kind of knew what was going to happen. And secondly, everyone's going to be in a room in the middle of January, the day before or the day of the national championship game. And if there's truly are complaints, which sounds like there are, things could get done. So, like, I imagine probably on the day of the national championship or sometime just before, just time after, we'll probably get some kind of a move here. All right, let's take a quick break. We come back, we'll dive into the portal. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles podcast. Real quick, before we dive into Oregon players, I think, Eric, going back to the playoff seeding, getting the bye, not having the bye, I think this is why it's another layer of why it's important to be able to have this bye week from a game perspective. Because Dan Lanning, I asked him kind of like, what's the plan right now? Like, what's this next week going to look like? Because we should know it's finals week. And historically, when you play in a New Year's Six bowl game or one just before the new year, typically at Oregon and typically across the country, this is like a non-football week. The team kind of gives its athletes, hey, you just went through 15 weeks of a grind of a football season. We're going to do a little bit of lifting, or maybe we're going to do a couple little walkthroughs, but this is an opportunity for you to get fresh, get healthy, do your rehab, come in every day, get treatment done, focus on your studies, and just kind of decompress a little bit from what you went through mentally.
Mm-hmm.
Get ready for the college football playoffs or whatever bowl you were playing in. And it allows Oregon's coaching staff right now to really hone in on self-scouting yourself, scouting out and preparing for Tennessee, for Ohio State, which they've already started doing previous to this week, but continuing that process, having a couple of workouts, but really it gives you an opportunity to split half or 3/4 or your entire staff to focus in now on the portal and retaining your players, going after guys that hit the portal, scouting guys that have hit the portal, setting up official visits, which it starts like it's already happening for Oregon. Meanwhile, Penn State, James Franklin's already talked about, like, hey, I have to prepare for a home game, which we're very thankful for, but I'm now also having to fight for retaining my roster, making sure we're in tune with guys that are hitting the portal and bringing them in if we can. It just added a whole nother element here. And I think this is going to be an advantage for the teams that do have the bye, where, yes, they're preparing for their next opponent, but at the same time, they've got more runway to focus on this week and portal recruiting and roster retainment than doing a whole bunch of other things and they all be like priority number one all at the same time.
Yeah, no, it is. And again, to my earlier point, it's unfortunate that you do have to juggle all this right now. It would make a ton more sense if the 12 teams that were in the playoff could just focus on being teams in the playoff and not juggling all of this. It's like you have free agency right in the middle of your postseason, which is just so backwards. But again, I said earlier, I'm understanding of, like, I don't know what the fix is, because you do have to try to get, that this quarter system, semesters, depending on the school, like, you start at a different time. You need to get this stuff figured out so kids can enroll at their new schools in time for spring football. I get all of that, but the unfortunate reality is this is where we are. And and it's unfortunate. And I do think, to your point, Matt, it's a big advantage for Oregon to be able to be, this is, we already know, based upon the prep recruiting and the past 2 years in the portal, Oregon's a really, really hot spot from a transfer perspective. And we know that this staff is really, really good in recruiting. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if we come out of this, 3-week break here going, man, Oregon's already done quite a bit of work here. And you look around the country and maybe some other schools haven't. And I think it's going to be a really interesting portal class, by the way, just to kind of, maybe this is this transition into some, to kind of flip over to what we're looking at here. But there are some really massive holes the more you look at this and try to project out for Oregon. And I will be, I think, fascinated to see how aggressive they are early. To my point a moment ago, maybe they get to January 1 and they've already got half a dozen portal commitments. Maybe they're more selective and they choose to wait and help people jump in at another date. Maybe they're don't really, maybe they don't have as many needs as we think they do. But I think it's going to be either way. This gives them an opportunity to kind of get all their ducks in a row, pun very much intended. And to kind of get a plan in place. We'll obviously see Dan Lanning working really hard with this, but this is where, like, Marshall Malco and Tyler Dean and all of that recruiting, Lydia Gibbs, that whole staff, that's just where they're going to do their heavy lifting to kind of get everything set up here. These are their weeks here, as well as the staff, obviously, to get everything sorted, to get the big board kind of figured out. And I'd imagine as they're sitting there right now, kind of taking in all the portal stuff, plans are being made. As I said earlier, Bear Alexander, it sounds like, may already be making an official visit at some point to Oregon. That's a one-time Georgia, one-time USC defensive lineman who was a 5-star out of high school, who's been kind of enigmatic, to put it lightly, in terms of his career. But the wheels are already in motion, and I expect this to be a very exciting month from a player acquisition perspective.
Dan Lanning has signed 40 portal guys in his first 3 recruiting classes. And I think if he had told us, hey, he'd get 3 guys, he'd get 4 or 3 years of cycles of portal additions in his 3 years here, and he'd sign 40 guys, I think we'd probably naturally think the most in a year would come year 1, where he's trying to flip the roster and get it as close to the image as he wants or would want. It's actually the fewest number of guys. It was 10. And then ahead of the 2023 season, it was 16, which is the highest. And then this past season, the Ducks added 14 guys. I'm not quite sure yet where this number is going to fall on from a numbers perspective of who they add, because there's a couple elements that we have to take into account here. One, Oregon's going to go up to 105 scholarships available to use if they want to, but they cannot go over 105 players on its roster. We also know that Oregon's extended a couple preferred walk-on offers to in-state players for the 2025 recruiting class that have signed and committed, and that would suggest that Oregon's probably going to be operating without 105 guys on scholarship. They're going to still use some of the walk-on past in the new era of college football. So they're not just going to go right up to that one number of 105. I think some of the roster departures is also going to impact this. And that's guys leaving from a portal perspective, hitting the portal, which we should note. Shaq McRoy has entered the portal, a true freshman offensive lineman from the Southeast. I would imagine he just goes back home closer to Alabama. And then Jackson Jones, a 4-star edge player, did not play this season as a true freshman. He's from Arizona. It wouldn't surprise me, ASU, Arizona, somewhere kind of closer to home as well. He's from Yuma City, so he's not really tied to either of those schools. He's not from any part of the state. Those are the two guys that have hit Oregon already. We might see another one. We might see a couple more pop in today, and then throughout the next couple of days. But the bigger thing is that could impact the additions is who stays for a final season, who goes pro. And I think there's going to be guys that are going to be on this discussion point that we talked about earlier, like roster retainment and being able to find ways to keep guys on your team. That this is also that area. Josh Connolly Jr. at left tackle is going to have a huge impact on what his decision is, whether it's going pro as an early round draft pick or coming back and trying to maybe position himself to be like a top 2 or top 3 tackle in next year's draft. His decision will probably have a huge impact on what Oregon does along the offensive line. They know they're going to lose Johnny Cornelius, but if he comes back, that opens the door. Well, hey, we only need 1 tackle, or maybe they add 2 linemen to the position. But if Connerly leaves, that opens the door for a more aggressive approach to the tackle position. Jordan James at running back, like what does he do? You also look at Evan Stewart at receiver. Like you would think he comes back, but he's had all year like, hey, this is a top round draft pick type player. What does he do from a decision standpoint? Derek Harmon is another one. That one feels like probably the most likely to leave, just because
for first round draft grade right now.
And he's not even first round. He's not even just a first rounder. He's like top 15, top 20 type guy, where it's not even like, hey, you're a fringe first rounder. You're fully entrenched. So that's another one that could maybe get complicated with who they add and how many they add at the position group. But that's going to be just as much as an important part as who leaves the program. And it's going to give a fluctuating number. It's going to move up and down quite a bit. I do think, I guess from a needs perspective, the 2 glaring ones to me, offensive line and probably specifically tackle, and then also tight end. And going out and finding some guys at both positions. And quite honestly, Eric, it wouldn't surprise me if they signed 2 tackles and they signed 2 tight ends in this class.
Do you want to just run down the positions on the team? And we'll keep this quick because we don't want to go for an hour and a half. But and just go yes, yay or nay. Basically, quarterback I think is no. You feel like it should be Dante Moore's job. If it's not, it's Austin Novosad. And if it's not one of those guys, maybe Jaron Kiave Sangapulatele, whose name I've been practicing for a week straight since he signed and have not sure I've perfected it, but feel pretty good about that. And Achilles Smith Jr., Luke Mogo, maybe one of those guys factors in. I don't think those guys are going to – I think it's kind of a 2-guy race, but I don't expect them to touch quarterback, but maybe we'll be wrong. Running back. If Jordan James goes, you definitely are taking one. Even if he returns, I question with maybe you want to take one. Noah Whittington has said he's going. He also has a year of eligibility back theoretically if he wants it. I guess if both those guys come back, obviously you're not touching a portal back, but there's a chance that both of them leave. And if that's the case, I think you could take up to 2 here, depending on how you feel about your developmental guys.
I would say 1 right now, and I would agree with you. Of if both of them come back, they're both you don't need to add anything.
You're good.
And then if they both go, then it probably turns into a 2 because you do not want to lean on Jaden Lamar, Jay Harris, and DeJuan Riggs as your 3 most experienced players. And that's no slight to them. They're just not ready yet.
Yeah, I mean, Jaden Lamar was their number 3 most of the season. He has, I don't have the stats pulled up, probably less than 20 carries, I would guess. And Jay Harris and Dink have probably less than that. So, yeah, I think that's a 1 or a 2, depending upon what happens with those veterans. Wide receiver, I think you could take a couple here. Yeah. I think it would make some sense. Now, you also feel like you've got some true freshmen and younger players developing in the background. You mentioned him, Evan Stewart, what he does. I think some of the aggressiveness hinges on his decision. Is he still seen as a guy who could be a day 1 or a day 2 pick? If the answer is yes, he's probably gone. If the answer is no,
he's first.
Absolutely. If he's not, he comes back. He can be the alpha for next year's group, and I think everybody would be really excited about that outcome. But if he goes, you have all 3 starters, from this position group are gone. We don't know Gary Bryant Jr.'s plan necessarily. He still has a year of eligibility. I'd imagine he wants to come back, but It's been a weird year with him, and we don't have necessarily full clarity on why. So I think that's a position where wide receiver feels like it's at least one, maybe two, depending upon how it goes. And then you're hopeful that, true freshmen haven't started a lot of games here, but between DeCorian Moore and Dallas Wilson, you feel like one of those two guys. Justice Lowe's been emerging this year. The true freshman class currently on the team with McClellan and with Pelham, who's played a little bit this year. You've got some young guys, but I do think you need to hit the portal here for a couple of days.
We should note, I think just as much of an impact as Evan Stewart and Gary Bryant, what they decide. Does Jurion Dickey, Kyler Casper, and Justice Lowell come back? If does a Dylan Gresham, who did not play a single down as a true freshman, does he leave? And this is where it kind of gets uncomfortable I think for me, maybe probably for you as well, of hypothetically talking about things with guys and their futures when they haven't put it out there. But the reality is, I think you can honestly say, like, if you didn't play as a true freshman or if you didn't play as a redshirt freshman, you're probably going through a discussion right now with your family of, is this the place where I want to be? And I'm not trying to say, like, Seb, you didn't play you played 4 games as a true freshman and you redshirted. Are you leaving? No. Like, did you play 0 games? Or did you play 1 game or more? And there's guys on this team, Jackson Jones is one of them, saw 0 snaps all of the season. Those are indicators to me of there's something there to watch. If they're not hurt and they don't play at all, it's probably a guy to keep a monitor of. Dylan Gresham's one of them. So I think some of the underclassmen too could dictate how many guys Oregon goes out and gets from a portal perspective. Because they need depth. They need guys that have been here before. I know they've got 2 5-stars coming in, but we've talked about it before on here. Like, that just doesn't automatically translate to instant success. Guys still have to earn it. But I'm with you. 1 or 2. Right now it's probably 1. It goes to 2 depending on who it is and who leaves.
And quickly on Dylan Gresham, there was no travel roster restrictions in terms of being able to bring players to Indianapolis. There was a number of players you could dress. Gresham, as far as I know, wasn't there at all. So that was sort of an indicator. Maybe he's one of those guys putting the name in. Maybe he was there and we just didn't see him and he was kind of hanging out without his jersey on. I don't know. But that was something that I noticed up in the press box on Saturday. Tight end, you mentioned it, Matt. This is, to me, just like the next position we'll get to on offense, the big one. I think you probably take 2 here. It was kind of, would you agree with this? Was it an upset that Oregon didn't get either Lincoln Q or Andrew Olesh? Because it felt like they were kind of trending for both of them at different times last week. Yeah. And it kind of felt like after they didn't get Cure, they'd get Olesh. Well, the fact they went 0 for 2 there, I like Vander Plug. Spent a little bit of time over the weekend watching some of his highlights. Super bouncy, athletic guy. Not necessarily someone I think you'd want to have as a rotational piece next year at the position. So I agree, Matt. I think this is a 2-player portal class at tight end. I think you get a veteran guy, and maybe you go get a guy who's like a sophomore who played a little bit last year but is a high upside player. But I think 2 makes a ton of sense at tight end right now. Yeah,
it's going to be exactly like a couple years ago where they went and tried to add a dynamic playmaker that just hits the field running, and then they had another guy where whether it's a depth piece and he's one and done, or it's a developmental piece where he's got a couple years of eligibility. Obviously, if you can get 2 like superstar tight ends that want to come play for you, you're not going to turn that down. But let's be realistic. Like, guys want snaps. They're in the portal for a reason. They're looking for more playing time, or they're looking for better development, or they're looking for opportunity to play, or they want to win. And more often than not, it's for portal guys, I want to play. And so if you add 1 elite dude, it's going to get that much harder to find another elite dude at that same position. When I know Oregon plays double tight end sets frequently in games, they often every game will play with 3, but those numbers are in pale comparison to how many receivers play per game. So
before people are up in arms over the tight end discourse, it's not because we think Kenyon Sadiq is bad. I think Kenyon Sadiq has proven to be really dynamic and exciting. He's just he's just kind of the only one next year. Like who you go rack through your brain here of who else you know on this roster at tight end, and you end up going, it's Roger Salipaga, who unfortunately just suffered a season-ending knee surgery, which might keep him out until like fall camp next year. It's possible. It looks pretty bad based on what we saw. And then it's the Vanderplug, the true freshman,
AJ Fubiano, but he's got injury history and he sat out all of this year.
And my understanding is he was never a scholarship player to begin with, based upon what we've heard from some people. So there's, again, you're looking at light numbers, which is why you need to take multiple. Offensive line, Matt, we kind of touched on it already. I know we talked about this after signing day, so we'll keep this one quick. But I think it's contingent on Connerly. I think you feel good about in the interior with Poncho back, with Ayuli, who played every snap in the Big Ten championship game, and then Bedford at the other spot. Those are your three interior guys. Johnny, you need to replace. I think you go portal for that. And then if you can't convince Josh to come back, you go portal again there. Because the unfortunate part is Shaq McRoy was their highest rated young piece in terms of the offensive line. Maybe they love Trent Ferguson, and there are some other guys, like Kavika Rogers, some players I really like, but you got to go out and find some tackles, I think.
Agreed.
Okay.
Defensive line.
Yeah, defensive line. Well, they're clearly going to take one, maybe, because Bear Alexander is like the one name. There's a couple others, but he's like the one that seems most likely right now to at least take a visit. You're losing quite a bit here, but you also have so much depth you've acquired over the last couple cycles that I think it's one or two guys.
I agree. It's probably one superstar right now that you feel like you can replicate a similar impact to what Derek Harmon or Jamari Caldwell has had this season, or what Jordan Riley or Casey Rogers had a couple years ago. But I don't think this is going to be one where they go out and sign a bunch, because, like you said, they've done a bunch of heavy lifting the last 2 years in the high school traditional ranks of recruiting, and unless you completely are sold on the idea that you completely whiffed on all of them, and that feels very, very unlikely.
Yes, we already like some of them, by the way. Yes. Some of them look good.
Yes. That's like the only reason why you would ever do this, but to then go over recruit them, you would get killed on the high school recruiting trail for any future guy you go after for a considerable amount of time, because look, they're going to bring you in. You're not going to do anything for 2 or 3 years, and they're going to recruit over you, and then you're going to get 1 year in the system. They're at a point now where they've recruited really well. Trust the depth, trust the talent evaluation, trust the skill that you've developed. And I think that's what's going to happen. They're going to add guys. They might add 1 or 2, but it's not going to be a complete overhaul.
Yeah, agreed. Linebacker is one where you could convince me they don't take any, but I also go, you're losing your 2 best linebackers. I think everybody's really liked Devin Jackson this year. He's been somebody who's really taken a step forward. Other than that, though, there's really nothing proven, right? You're looking at like a Jerry Mixon, who played maybe even more last year than this year, and then some true freshmen who've not played at all. So maybe it's 1, maybe it's 0. It depends on, I think, how they feel like they're developing.
Yeah, this is maybe the hardest to project because they've recruited the position really well. But as you noted, there's no one behind Devin Jackson returning from really an experienced standpoint. Jerry Mixon's played a little bit, about half the year this season. I don't think he's shown, though, where you just feel automatic he's going to be an all-conference caliber starting linebacker in the Big Ten next season. And that's no slight to him. He just hasn't played enough.
Right.
But so we don't really know that yet. I think you got to add 1, probably just to give some veteran leadership, a veteran voice in the room, because it's a group where it's Devin Jackson and then there's a bunch of redshirt freshmen or redshirt sophomores or true freshmen in the room. And you just need a little bit more of just, hey, this is how we operate in the linebacker room from a note-taking perspective, from a scouting perspective, from a training perspective in the offseason. You need a little bit more voice and vocal leadership in that room, plus talent, obviously.
Another one that's really fascinating is corner, because you're losing your 3 best guys, but Jaleel Florence has been kind of hanging around waiting. That's a starting caliber player. Mm-hmm. I imagine he's going to be healthy maybe at some point for the playoffs. He's one of the few guys who's been out all year who hasn't been ruled out from a season ending in terms of availability report. I think he's even posted on social media recently something kind of encouraging about, maybe it was cryptic, but like of coming back at some point. That I think is one of your starters next year. And then you've got they got 3 of the top 8 true freshman corners, and then and then you've got the guys who are freshman and sophomore this year. Whether it's Roderick Pleasant, I know Dalen Austin's more of in the slot, but we'll kind of include him for this conversation. Ifeoma Badegwu, Dakota Fields, like these are highly regarded, highly thought of young corners. I wonder if you take one here or if you go, you know what, Jalil's going to be our veteran and our best corner probably. And there's enough guys between the true freshmen and some of these younger players that we see the development that we're not going to touch it. But I could also see it being a spot where, like last year, they took three of them, or two or three guys. I mean, Brandon Johnson, I'm not grouping in there, but they took a bunch of them. Maybe they feel the same way again. I don't know, but I think kind of similar to defensive line and in your point there, Matt, they've recruited the position so well. I think if you go out here and you bring in three again or two again, you're going to probably lead to some departures of guys that down the line could be really exciting.
Yeah, I'm with you. This is going to be a hard one to maneuver because you probably need to add some pieces. I would probably land at safety more than corner, just because we've seen them recruit so well at the cornerback position. Safety, there's Peyton Woodyard and a couple other guys, but not as much, I guess, depth as there is at the cornerback position.
So yeah, I agree on safety. Just to wrap it, I think you at least need one there. Maybe you take two because you're losing both Taishim and Kobe. Tyler Turner had played a little bit early in the season, not much since. You mentioned Woodyard. Kingston Lopa was in the game against Penn State. I don't know if
that tells you something. Like
yeah, it does.
He's probably in line to be the next, one of the next younger guys to step into a role. They just don't play a guy, by happenstance like that. Like even if I know he's a taller player at like 6'5" at safety, and they were playing him specifically to kind of follow Tyler Warren wherever he went. But even in that scenario, like if they had any inkling of doubt that he couldn't handle that situation, he never would have played.
Yeah, so, I'll be curious with him to see how much he plays in the college world playoff, because was that, to your point, kind of matchup related of like, hey, this is our biggest safety to put on Tyler Warren, it's a new look, or was that this guy is ready to be a contributor? So we just ran through that all, and I think like aside from quarterback, we're like maybe they'll take at least a guy at every position on the team. It sort of speaks to some of the issues here. Like
I think that's going to be for everybody though. For the teams that are truly competing at a national level, and Dan's talked about this. It's developing your program through the high school ranks and then filling in the stopgaps with the portal. And if you want to continue to maintain a program that every single year you are viewed as a national championship team and someone that should be consistently throughout the year a top 10-ish team, you're probably going to have to add a player basically at every position to fill those gaps. Because think how many big plays like a Brandon Johnson or an Atticus Sappington or a Jamari Caldwell or an Evan Stewart. Like Evan Stewart maybe was a big addition, a big portal ad, but some of these other guys that Oregon has had that they've added this season and in previous years, like they didn't move the needle nationally, but they showed up and they made a play or two in every game, or they had a moment where they dominated in one big game, and that could have been the difference in Oregon losing or winning because of that portal addition. Like if you're going to compete at a high level, you got to fill every hole. You cannot go into a season going, well, like we didn't recruit this place, at this position from a high school perspective, the last 2 years, and we just kind of have to figure out a way to get by this. Like in today's day and age, if that happens, you have a stopgap, and it's the portal. And I think Oregon and every other school, it's in the same position as the Ducks. They're going to recruit basically a player at every position. Just talent raises the bar, raise the standard, and force everyone else to adjust.
I think it would be unlikely they take less than 10, which you've already established is the low threshold. And I think it would be a little surprising if they took more than 16. I think it's going to be kind of right in the sweet spot where it was a couple of years ago, where it's 13, 14. That kind of feels like the number you're looking at. And that means that you probably are addressing basically every position and a couple positions twice or three times.
Yes, agreed. 100%. It's going to be fun to see what happens. It's going to be crazy for Oregon. This is kind of where their focus is at this week. From a portal perspective and roster retainment, everyone else is preparing for playoffs. Obviously, Oregon is too, but not to the full extent. But we've already seen two. Jared's already got the transfer portal tracker up. 24/7 Sports has a running show all day on Monday. So if you don't see it on Monday, go back to the YouTube page, watch it there. We'll have full coverage of the portal on duckterritory.com and more coverage of the Oregon football team as they gear up for the first 12-team playoff later this month. But until the next one, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles Podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.